Hi, friends. Maggie Creech here, host of Revolution Revisited. If you've been tuning in, you know we're diving deep into the people and stories that made the American Revolution what it really was. Messy, bold, and full of rebellion right here in Virginia. And if you've learned something new or found yourself saying, wait, I never knew that, I'd love your help spreading the word. Wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, leave us a rating or a quick review. It only takes a few seconds, but it helps more listeners discover Revolution Revisited and supports the work of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the team behind this show. Every review keeps history alive and keeps Virginia's stories in the spotlight as we commemorate America's 250th anniversary. So go ahead, hit those stars, drop a line, and keep spreading the word. Thanks for listening and for making history with us.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. As the 250th anniversary of America's independence approaches, dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. It's the summer of 1776, and across the colonies, the language of the Enlightenment is reshaping what people believe is possible. The monarchy is no longer a foregone conclusion, and Virginians like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson aren't just echoing European philosophers. They're refining those ideas for their own revolution. Meanwhile, the war itself is already underway. From January through April, fighting raged in the Carolinas, New England, and Canada, reminding every delegate that these debates about liberty aren't theoretical. They're happening under fire. To help us unpack the intellectual landscape of the spring and summer of 1776, we're joined by
John Rialsta. I'm a fellow at the Virginia Humanities. I am formerly the acting director of the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and I'm a researcher and writer.
George Mason drafted the Virginia Declaration of Rights, setting out a vision of freedom rooted in natural law. Thomas Jefferson drew from the same intellectual well, declaring that all men are created equal. But what was liberty to them? Freedom of conscience? Freedom from tyranny? Freedom to govern oneself? Or all of these at once? Their words are lofty, imperfect, and world-altering. So let's talk influences. Where are these revolutionary ideas coming from?
The leaders in America, the Jeffersons, the Madisons, the Adams, these people are reading widely, and they're reading John Locke. Certainly Locke is enormously important. They're reading Montesquieu, enormously important, separation of powers. They're reading Trenchard and Gordon. They're reading Sidney. So they're reading all these Enlightenment thinkers, Hutchinson and Scott's, a lot of people from Scotland. But what's interesting is you can't have a revolution with simply intellectuals. And so they've got to be able to communicate those very important Enlightenment ideals, those Enlightenment principles to the people, and the people have to take it on. Critical idea about the Enlightenment that I think people can miss, it's all about learning, doing better, progress. And progress requires virtue. It requires a commitment to the civic society. It's communitarian. So when they're talking about liberty, it's liberty to participate, because they're dealing with a monarchy where you don't have rights, where the king and the nobility, based on birth, get all of the rights. But liberty is for them about your right to participate, your rights to be part of government, your right to get ahead, your ability to get ahead.
Before we get to the big national Declaration of Independence, Virginia was already drafting its own blueprint for freedom, a state constitution and a Declaration of Rights. But the story doesn't actually begin in Virginia. In late 1775, New Hampshire wrote to the Continental Congress with a problem. Their royal governor had fled, leaving them effectively without a government. What should they do? John Adams and Virginia's own Richard Henry Lee urged them to draft a new constitution. On May 4th, 1776, Rhode Island officially renounced their allegiance to King George. And on May 10th of 1776, Congress extended that call to all the colonies, a strong recommendation to create governments aligned with the cause of independence. So the 5th Virginia Convention convened in Williamsburg, and one question still hung in the air. Should Virginia formally call for independence? It was out of this debate that Richard Henry Lee rose and introduced his now famous resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. You might think that independence was already a foregone conclusion. After all, Virginia was already acting as a self-governing state. The king had branded the colonies as rebels, and British troops, the superpower of the 18th century, were pressing hard. Yet even then, some delegates hesitated. Declaring independence outright before securing military allies like France or Spain could be ruinous. Even Patrick Henry, bold to the point of reckless in most debates, voiced that worry. Others countered that independence had to come first, that no nation would ally with subjects still claiming loyalty to a king. And out of that tension came Virginia's resolutions for independence, passed in late May 1776. And just days later, Lee carried them north to Philadelphia, where they became the foundation for the Continental Congress's own Declaration of Independence.
Interestingly, Lee takes those to Philadelphia. Jefferson shows up. He was 6 weeks late because he had had a 6-week-long migraine. But he gets to Philadelphia on, I believe it was May 14th. 2 days later, he writes back to Virginia and says, I want to leave Philadelphia. Can't I come back to Virginia? Which, of course, he would have never drafted the Declaration of Independence. Richard Henry Lee's wife is very ill. And so Richard Henry Lee says, I've got to go. My wife is very, very ill. And so Lee leaves Philadelphia after delivering those resolutions. And Jefferson is left then and picked to help draft the Declaration.
Back in Virginia, George Mason stepped to the forefront, drafting what would become the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the state constitution. His words, all men are by nature equally free and independent, would reverberate forward into the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. As George Mason began drafting Virginia's new Constitution in Williamsburg, Thomas Jefferson was hundreds of miles away in Philadelphia, serving in the Continental Congress. From there, Jefferson wrote that he wished he were back home, helping to shape Virginia's government instead of working on a national declaration. True to form, he couldn't resist contributing anyway. He drafted his own version of a Virginia Constitution and sent it south, though it arrived too late to influence Mason's work. In Jefferson's absence, Mason, joined by Edmund Pendleton and George Wythe, carried the project forward. The result was extraordinary. The world's first written declaration of religious freedom and freedom of conscience, and a model of Republican government that would echo far beyond Virginia.
And up to that point, people talked about toleration. We'll let you practice your religion, as opposed to you have a right to practice your religion. Power to the people. That's coming from Mason's Declaration of Independence. We the people. Power is not coming from the king, through the nobility, through the parliament, to the people. Power is in the people and moving up through the government. Separation of powers. George Mason, I mentioned Montesquieu, the great French political scientist. Mason is talking about separation of powers, critically important today. The executive cannot usurp the power of the judiciary and the legislative. Freedom of the press is in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So many of these ideas. Now, Mason is not inventing them either. Again, it's percolating. They're getting these ideas from multiple sources, and they have to be ideas that the people can embrace. They can't simply be an intellectual elite idea. You can't have a revolution unless they're stating things that the people say, yeah, we can fight for that.
Virginia, of course, takes great pride in these men who paved the way for our country's founding documents. But as the spring and summer of '76 show us, these conversations were happening across the country. Were Virginians the decisive tipping point, or just one voice among many states already moving in the same direction?
A lot of people are saying things like that. Later, years later, North Carolina comes up with this claim that, well, no, we were the first to declare independence. Very questionable claim. So, for example, when the Continental Congress says in the middle of May, look, colonies, you need to draft your own constitutions, your own laws. John Adams says that's independence. I mean, we basically declared independence. And he's not entirely wrong about that. I mean, we're going to throw off our royal charters. We're going to throw off all of our previous constitutive documents, and we're going to create our own constitution. So there's a whole series of things that occur. And this, when does independence occur, goes right up to July 4th. July 2nd is when the Continental Congress votes independence, but then they don't declare until July 4th, 2 days later. Well, John Adams always says, well, July 2nd, that was what was important, not that Thomas Jefferson document. We don't care about that. It was John Adams in the Declaration on July 2nd. So you're right. There's a lot of things that are going on when New Hampshire drafts its own constitution at the end of 1775. That's very important. When the colonies say, we're going to allow our merchants to trade with other nations, a violation of the Navigation Acts. That sounds an awful lot like independence. We're going to ignore Parliament and Britain. That's, I believe, March or April of 76. So these things all build up. Documents, though, are important. Dates are important. That famous resolution from Virginia, these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That's important because it gets reprinted. It gets reprinted all over the 13 colonies, now states, and people read it. And if you're going to have a revolution, the people have to say, yeah, I'm willing to fight for that. I'm willing to suffer, because there was great suffering in the revolution. So you have to be able to communicate those things in a way that brings in not all the people. I know you've talked about the loyalists. There's a lot of people who are loyalists, but you have to bring in a very substantial majority of the people, and they have to believe they're fighting for something important. And so all of these steps lead us up to July 4th and the Declaration of Independence.
So, by June of 1776, Congress understood that declaring independence meant little without building the machinery to sustain it. When Virginia's Lee Resolution for Independence was introduced on June 7th, the delegates quickly laid out 3 urgent tasks. First, a declaration itself. On June 11th, Congress appointed what became known as the Committee of Five. John Adams of Massachusetts, a sharp-tongued lawyer and relentless advocate for independence; Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, the colony's most famous diplomat; Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a respected legislator; Robert Livingston of New York, an experienced statesman; and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, whose eloquent pen would shape the document we remember today.
It's Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The last 2 of them, nobody remembers. And Jefferson really is the primary draftsman. I mean, if you look at his original draft versus what's ultimately adopted, and the committee itself, the Committee of Five, as it's referred to, makes very minor changes. Franklin, I think, for example, suggests the inalienable rights language. I think Jefferson had a much more wordy version of that. So the committee makes a few changes. The Continental Congress is going to make a lot of changes. But the Committee of Five, when they're appointed, Adams is certainly understood as one of the leading rabble-rousers for independence. Franklin is understood as the senior statesman of the Continental Congress, somebody who everybody likes Franklin, everybody agrees with Franklin. And of course, it's important. Franklin says, I'm not going to write this document because I write little quips, early to bed and early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's the way Franklin writes. We don't want a declaration written by Franklin. People would have been laughing and said, wow, this is a great humorous document. We don't want a declaration written by John Adams. It would have been 20 pages long and nobody would read it. We don't want a document written. Roger Sherman makes a point. Look, this is not my thing. He's not an intellectual. Livingston has several problems. He's from New York, and New York is one of the holdouts on independence. So that's partially why he's there, but it also means he may not be the best person to draft this. Certainly a very skilled writer. So it does fortuitously, it's important that, as I said, Jefferson is put on the committee sort of at the last minute. I think if Richard Henry Lee had not gone home it would have been very hard not to have made Richard Henry Lee the Virginian on that committee. And Richard Henry Lee also drafts beautifully, not as beautifully as Jefferson, but I think it's very important it was Jefferson. And as I said, I don't think the committee makes that many changes. The Congress certainly does. It's interesting, Jefferson, up to this point, had been very quiet in the Continental Congress. He was very good on committee. He was very good at drafting things, but he really was not a vocal leader. And so John Adams is on every committee. John Adams is on the military committee. He's on the treaty committee. John Dickinson is on the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation. Jefferson's not put on those committees. But Adams, and it is Adams, plays a very critical role, realizing, but Jefferson is so good at writing. He writes these beautiful things. It's Adams who tells Jefferson, we really need you on this committee to draft the Declaration. And Adams argues for that with the Continental Congress. And so when they have a vote for who's going to be on the Declaration Committee, Jefferson gets the most votes, which is odd. He's quiet. He's not like Richard Henry Lee. He's loud, not like Sam Adams or John Adams or Benjamin Franklin. But John Adams says, no, we really need Jefferson to help us pull together that language. But as you say, there's all these other things going on. You have to have an Articles of Confederation. You better have a treaty with France.
Second, a plan for government. On June 12th, just one day later, Congress appointed another committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first attempt at a constitution. The Articles would bind the 13 states together in a loose union, giving Congress authority in matters like diplomacy and war, while leaving most power in the hands of the states. And third, foreign alliances. Also on June 12th, Congress created a committee to prepare what became known as the Model Treaty. Its purpose? To outline how the United States should negotiate trade and military agreements abroad, especially with France and Spain. In that single week of June 1776, the Continental Congress was juggling 3 tasks at once: proclaim independence, design a government, and convince the world to stand with them.
The Articles of Confederation are very limited, and historians, lawyers certainly would describe them not as a kind of constitution the way we think of it, but really as a treaty almost among the different states. A compact is the term that's used, and it's understood that Virginia is independent, Pennsylvania is independent, New Jersey is independent. And so that's why the Articles of Confederation, for example, to make any significant change, it requires unanimity. All of the colonies, all of the new states have to agree. So it's a very limited document. The constitutions that are being drafted, the Virginia Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, the New Hampshire Constitution, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, critically important document, those are much more of what we think of as a constitution. So again, I hadn't thought of the question in those terms, but I'd say what Virginia and Mason are doing has a much broader impact on the Declaration of Independence, and we're seeing a lot of that language coming out of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and then it's influencing the U.S. Constitution. But keep in mind, even in Virginia, and John Adams, let me put on my John Adams hat for a moment. John Adams, earlier in 76, had written his thoughts on government, and he sends it around. I mean, and people were asking him, well, wait a minute, how does one create a new government? And Adams says, well, I have the answer. And of course, it's a couple hundred pages long. But Adams is, for example, critically emphasizing separation of powers. Adams is saying critically, you have to have 3 separate branches: executive, legislative, judicial, and they have to be separate. Now, he doesn't create that idea. Montesquieu had said it. Other people had said it. But Adams is putting this in writing and saying, as we create these new U.S. constitutions, these are some thoughts.
When we think about the Articles of Confederation, it's easy to see them as a short-lived experiment. Ratified in 1781 and replaced just 6 years later, the Articles created a weak central government that quickly proved inadequate. Congress could declare war, but not raise taxes to pay for the war. It could negotiate treaties, but not enforce them. The system left the new nation fragile and disjointed. By contrast, Virginia's 1776 Constitution, and others modeled after it, cast a much longer shadow. Drafted by George Mason, it included a Declaration of Rights that proclaimed all men are, by nature, equally free and independent, and guaranteed freedoms like trial by jury, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. While the Articles of Confederation faltered, documents like Virginia's Constitution provided a sturdy model for balancing government power and protecting individual rights. In fact, you could argue that Virginia's 1776 framework influenced the United States Constitution of 1787 far more than it ever touched the Articles of Confederation. Where the Articles showed the dangers of too little central authority, Virginia's Constitution helped to shape the balance between state and federal power and inspired the Bill of Rights itself. As the Continental Congress debated independence, they understood that breaking from Britain would require more than a simple declaration. Words alone could not create a nation, but they could define one. And so, the Declaration of Independence was carefully structured to do two things at once: proclaim enduring principles and document the Crown's abuses that made revolution unavoidable. The first section, the opening two paragraphs, lays out these principles. Jefferson declares that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he goes further. At a time when nations were defined by blood and faith, English and Anglican, French and Catholic, Jefferson insists on something startlingly new. Americans, despite their differences of class, culture, language, and religion, are one people. And at the close of this principles section comes another revolutionary claim. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Power is not a birthright of kings. It belongs to the people. The second, far longer section is a detailed list of grievances against the king. 27 charges document tyranny in action, suspending laws, ignoring parliament, imposing standing armies on civilians, denying trial by jury, denying due process. Each complaint makes the case that the British government has violated the social contract and that the colonies are justified in creating a new government of their own design.
So Jefferson says, look, the king is preventing us from adopting laws that we need. Taxes without consent are obviously central to it. They talk about that. They talk about trade. There's one also with modern resonance. How dare the king block our trade with other countries? How dare the king impose taxes, you might say tariffs, without approval of Congress, without approval of Parliament in their case. A lot of people, a lot of historians, and a lot of people at the time comment on this whole list is about the king. Well, why is it all about the king? You've been complaining about Parliament up to this point. Jefferson figures out, and he's not the only one, but the Continental Congress figures out it has to be about the king if we're going to have independence. Because up to that point, what they had been saying was Parliament is interfering with our rights. Parliament is imposing these taxes that we haven't consented to. Parliament is adopting the intolerable acts, the coercive acts. And Jefferson, for example, in the Summary View of the Rights of British America, specifically says, look, we're willing to be loyal to the king so long as we have our own legislature. And there have been proposals. Galloway, who was one of the great loyalists, says, well, why don't we have a system where we're loyal to the king, but we have an American legislature, an American parliament? And so that was what everybody thought things were going to. Now, still not easy. We still weren't there, but that's what everybody's talking about in 1774, 1775, 1776. And so to go to true independence, you have to say, no, we can't be loyal to the king. They had already made their arguments about why Parliament was being unfair with taxation without representation. But the shift to say the king, that's where you go from, oh, we could be part of the British Commonwealth to, no, we have to be totally independent because the king is also a tyrant.
Even as Jefferson was drafting his eloquent list of grievances, it's important to remember the Americans did not start out hating the king. Even in early 1776, many colonists still celebrated his birthday in their homes, admired his image, and repeatedly appealed to him to protect them from the overreach of Parliament and corrupt ministers. However, Thinkers like Thomas Paine would argue for a shift in his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776. He argued that the king himself, his authority, his choices, his ministers, were now part of the problem. Paine's pamphlet, published in January 1776, crystallized that growing sentiment, giving Jefferson a framework to transform broad revolutionary ideas into a specific, searing list of grievances. And for Americans, the list resonated. It was their lived experience. Some grievances, like the presence of standing armies, struck a chord across the colonies. Troops were stationed not just in Massachusetts, but in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, enforcing laws and creating a sense of intimidation. To Americans, these standing armies were a clear sign of tyranny, a tangible threat to the liberties they claimed as their own. Other complaints were more localized, rooted in the daily lives of specific colonies. In Philadelphia, the Crown's interference in commerce and the imposition of taxes without consent sparked outrage, crystallized in episodes like the lesser-known Philadelphia Tea Party. South Carolina had its own grievances, from the obstruction of local laws to the stationing of troops in Charleston. And in Virginia, the events we've spoken about in previous episodes, the dismissal of the House of Burgesses, restrictions on westward expansion, and Dunmore's proclamation, all make an appearance in the lists of grievances. By compiling these incidents together, Jefferson and the Committee of Five created a record that spoke to every colony. For Americans, the ideals, the language of equality, liberty, and consent resonated deeply.
Most of the comments in England are actually about the grievances, saying, no, that's wrong, that's unfair, the king didn't do that. And this is one of the reasons why historians often focus on the grievances. The one very famous comment about the principles is Johnson, of course, saying we hear a lot of squeals of liberty from those who drive slaves. I'm paraphrasing. So historians sometimes say, see, that whole principle section, the first two paragraphs, nobody cared about that. I think we can miss the point there. It's that they weren't going to argue with that. We're not going to say, oh, no, the king is better than all the rest of Americans. We're not going to say the nobility is better than everybody else. How do you argue with all men are created equal? How do you argue with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So it's not unimportant, and I think it's critically important. You started, fair enough, with how do they read it in England, but it's very important how they read it in Poughkeepsie, how do they read it in Boston, and those principles are at the center of that. When people start thinking about it a little bit more, think about where those principles lead you. We're not a monarchy anymore. So when you say one people, and we say governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, we're talking about a republic. Equality. That's not a king and a monarch anymore. That's a republic.
Even decades later, the language of the Revolution would be invoked in ways spanning a variety of belief systems. During the Civil War, the Confederacy adopted revolutionary imagery, calling on Washington, invoking liberty, but simultaneously rejecting the Declaration's core claim that all men are created equal. It was a cognitive dissonance that reminds us how enduring and malleable these words could be.
It's significant that when the Confederacy starts, one of the first things they say in their constitutional convention is, that all men are created equal. That's wrong. Because if you're going to defend slavery, and we could talk about the inconsistency of slavery with equality, but if you're going to defend slavery, you have to attack the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence becomes a midwife for the end of slavery. That's why Frederick Douglass is quoting the Declaration of Independence. It's why the women at Seneca Falls are quoting the Declaration of Independence. So those principles that we hold dear really are essential to being able to declare independence, being able to gather the people and say, no, this is our country. This is what we're fighting for.
As the Continental Congress reviewed Jefferson's draft of the Declaration, they made several significant edits, changes that reveal both the politics and the compromises of the moment. Perhaps the most consequential was Jefferson's original paragraph on slavery. He blamed the king for bringing slavery to the colonies, citing the crown's refusal to allow laws that would have banned the importation of enslaved people. For Southern delegates in South Carolina and Georgia, that paragraph was a deal breaker. They were not about to sign a document condemning a practice central to their economy. And while historians debate the accuracy of Jefferson's claim, the king did not create slavery outright, the reality is more nuanced. The Crown and Parliament actively blocked early efforts to limit the transatlantic trade, ensuring that slavery continued to enrich both Britain and colonial economies. Jefferson's point, in part, was to highlight the king's obstruction of reform, framing it as a moral as well as a political failing. Yet Jefferson's argument carries an undeniable tension. He himself was a lifelong slave owner. While he criticized the Crown for permitting the trade, he profited from the institution, maintained his own enslaved workforce, and supported policies that entrenched slavery in Virginia. The Declaration's lofty ideals of equality and unalienable rights existed alongside Jefferson's personal contradictions, a reminder that even the architects of liberty were bound by the realities and hypocrisies of their time. Moral aspiration collided with economic incentive, creating a tension that would haunt the nation for decades. The other major edit Congress made was to Jefferson's critique of the British people themselves. In his draft, he had referred to unfeeling brethren, condemning them alongside the king. Congress removed that language, understanding that alienating potential allies back in Britain could be politically dangerous. Even as Americans prepared for war, they would eventually need voices in England advocating for peace and for recognition of the new nation. Taken together, these edits show the careful balancing act behind the Declaration. It was a document that had to unify 13 colonies with divergent economies, interests, and sensibilities. It had to declare independence, assert universal principles, and build a case against tyranny, all while keeping the fragile coalition intact. The Declaration of Independence was never simply a statement of ideals. It was a negotiated strategic argument designed to rally people to a cause, to justify rebellion, and lay the groundwork for a nation still being imagined, even as its authors wrestled with their own contradictions.
Abraham Lincoln talks about this in the run-up to the Civil War. He says that people take that language from Jefferson, and Lincoln is a great Jeffersonian. He loves the Declaration. He loves a lot of what Jefferson says. And he says people take that language from Jefferson and they see, oh, okay, obviously it's a lie. We all know all men are created. Obviously it's a hypocrisy. Obviously, at best, it's something that will only happen among the angels. Mere humans can't really treat all men equally. And Lincoln says this is dangerous. I think he's a harbinger of returning tyranny. So the fact that we don't meet our principles is not a reason to reject the principles. It's a reason to try harder. It's a reason to continue to work on them. And I do think at one level, the founders understood that. So, is Jefferson a hypocrite for having enslaved people and saying all men are created equal? Yes. If you want to say that, that's hypocritical. But does he recognize that in principle, their humanity has to be recognized and their rights have to be recognized? Yes, he recognizes that as well.
So what about the line, all men created equal?
Look, this is aspirational. It's not a reason to reject it. It's a reason to work on it, to work harder. I think the other thing that would be good to understand is it's a phrase that so easily spins off the tongue, that we've heard so often. I think really appreciating the centrality of that phrase to the revolution and to our nation and to having a republic. That's what it means to have a republic. Everybody gets to participate. Everybody gets to vote. It's not saying all men are created the same. We understand that. We understand that people are not identical. In fact, everybody is different. That's obvious. But when we say equality, it means equal before the law. John Adams, this is a nation of laws, not of men. Thomas Paine, in America, the law is king. That's what it's saying. When you say the law is king, what we're saying is, look, we don't have kings. We don't have people that are better than everybody else. The law controls all of us, and we all participate in the law. So I think those 2 points, that it is aspirational, it's aspirational today as it was then, and the centrality of equality for the American experiment, for the American nation.
Of course, ideas alone do not make a revolution. Outside the rooms where these documents are being crafted, a war is waging. Before July 4th ever arrived, independence was already unfolding.
We're facing a war with, as said, the 18th century superpower. After Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775, the British Army is basically holed up in Boston. We have an American army led by George Washington after June surrounding them, and they eventually get the British Army to leave Boston because they realize they're in an untenable position. If the British can seize New York, they can sort of divide New England, all those radicals in New England, from the rest of the country. And it's a scary time. The Declaration ends with, "We pledge our lives, our sacred honor." Those weren't just words. They realize if we lose this, we're all subject to be hung as traitors. So it's a very worrisome time. Washington is moving his troops to New York. We have fought the British down in Charleston, successfully in Charleston, kept them from invading Charleston at that time. They will later in the war. But it's worrisome. One thing that I've always thought is so important about the Declaration that people ought to remember. On July 9th, so the Declaration is adopted on July 4th. It's printed that night, late into the night. The Dunlop broadside is printed. It's available by July 5th. Copies are sent to everyone. Look at this Declaration. And it starts to be reprinted throughout the country. Washington gathers the army on July 9th. He has every company parade and reads them the Declaration of Independence. And it's after that declaration is read that a bunch of them, we don't know who exactly went, but they go into New York and they tear down the statue of George III. They tear down the king's statue because, okay, we're no longer going to be subject to a monarchy. We're no longer going to be subject to a king. And the same thing is happening throughout America as that declaration arrives and people are reading it. People are reading it in Virginia. They're reading it in South Carolina. But it's because, the war is really just getting going. And the war is going to be bad for a number of years. We know they're going to get driven out of New York badly. They're going to lose. They're going to lose again and be driven out of White Plains. The army's going to be chased across New Jersey until the end of the year. We get to the Battle of Trenton. And then in the next year, they're going to be chased out of Philadelphia. So we're going to have a very difficult military circumstance. And I've always thought it was so extremely important that George Washington thought this declaration was so important that he wanted it read to his troops. These are young men, many of them. They're not well off. Many of them economically are not necessarily well off. And that becomes a bigger issue in the army over time. A lot of historians will point out the relative wealth of the army or the relative poverty of the Continental Army gets much, much worse into 1779, 1780, 1781. But still, these raw retreats, they're not rich, they're not wealthy. To have their officer at the instruction of General Washington stand up and read to them, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That we, the people, have a right to create our own government." Yes, I've always thought that is, in fact, important. And Washington wouldn't have done it if he didn't think it was important.
By July 5th, 1776, the first printed broadsides carried the Declaration into homes, taverns, and meeting halls across the colonies. But the work was not finished. New York, having abstained, did not consent until July 9th, allowing Congress to declare the vote unanimous. On August 2nd, delegates began signing the parchment copy. The rule was strict. Only those who had supported independence could add their names. Some, like Joseph Galloway, abandoned Congress entirely. Others, such as John Dickinson, remained committed to the Patriot cause, but refused to sign. Over the next weeks, signatures accumulated until 56 stood recorded. The act of signing the Declaration was itself extraordinary. Congressional resolutions were usually recorded, printed, and filed away. This time, delegates gathered to put their names on parchment, risking their fortunes, even their lives. By affixing signatures, they turned a political statement into a permanent symbol. The Declaration was no longer just words on a page. It was a challenge to Britain, a rallying cry for the colonies, and a beacon to the world. Imperfect though it was, it embodied the audacity of a revolution, a promise that liberty, once declared, could not easily be contained.
Nobody has a signed copy of the Articles of Confederation. Nobody has a signed copy of the Constitution because they didn't. I think you get the clerk's signature at the bottom. They understood this is a really important document, and we want to be able to get copies of it made and engraved and be able to send it, because they do send it. There's a copy sent to each one of the 13 colonies. Some of those get stolen during the Civil War by Union soldiers who happened to be marauding through southern capitals. Actually, it was not too many years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, one of them popped back up. I think somebody had the North Carolina version and was trying to sell it. They understood this was a document that people were going to embrace and see as important. I don't know. Well, I suspect they had to send a copy of the Articles of Confederation around to each of the colonies, but the fact that they had the Declaration engraved and signed is significant.
The Declaration, far from a single thunderclap, was forged through debate, dissent, and persistence. Its words reached beyond Congress. The principles of representation and consent of the governed began to ripple through American society, unsettling the institution of slavery. Many Southern leaders remained enslavers, but in the North, the ideals of liberty and equality spurred concrete change. Vermont's 1777 Constitution abolished slavery outright. Massachusetts' Constitution of 1780 followed, while Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation law, ensuring future generations would be free. These were not abstractions. They were direct applications of the Declaration's promise. Even in the South, liberty's language forced cracks into the system. Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia all enacted manumission laws. In Delaware, the enslaved population dropped to less than 1%. In Virginia, manumission surged after 1782, with paperwork filed by enslavers stating that they believed in the natural rights of all mankind as their reasoning for freeing their enslaved workers. Progress slowed in the early 19th century as Southern states restricted emancipation, but the seeds had been planted. The Declaration's ideals could, slowly and unevenly, remake society, a topic we'll discuss in future episodes. And so, as we reflect on the Declaration today, we can ask ourselves, is it the pinnacle of American revolutionary thought, a moment when ideals reach their zenith? Or is it perhaps the beginning of a long, difficult reckoning, a confrontation with the reality of what it truly means to turn words to action? We'd, of course, like to thank John Ragasta for his participation and expertise. We'd also like to thank you, our listeners, and encourage you to check out further resources like the primary sources and featured collection items mentioned in today's episode at virginiahistory.org/Revolution Revisited. That wraps up Season 2, but don't go anywhere. There's much more to come. Stay tuned as we continue the journey through the American Revolution, uncovering the battles, the people, and the moments that shaped a nation.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Revolution Revisited is a production of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Our production staff includes Haley Finner, Maggie Creech, Riley Reynolds, Nicole Martorana, and Tracy Schneider. Be sure to subscribe to get notified about upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.